So I arrived in Vietnam on August 1st, 1968, and I was assigned to Vung Tau, which is the 36th Evacuation Hospital on the South China Sea. So the sea was close by and it was beautiful, but it was hot. I walked into the unit that I was assigned to. There were 65 beds in that unit. It was a Quonset hut. Every bed was full, and there was no air conditioning. And I was assigned as a surgical nurse. And so it was preoperative and it was postoperative care. And never, of course, in my young experience, even though I had been working in emergency rooms while I was in nursing schools, had I seen such terrible injuries. And our young soldiers were not just injured from weaponry, artillery, small arms fire, what have you, all the myriad of accidents that our soldiers also um, were treated for. But we had tropical diseases. We had snake bites and sea snake bites because the troops would come down for R&R on the South China Sea, and even the sea wasn't a safe place to be. Even our R&R wasn't a safe place to be. And there were leeches, because this was in the south part of Vietnam and more in the Delta, and our troops would come in with leeches all over their bodies. And water buffalo could be very dangerous, and we had patients who were injured by water buffalo attacks. And so when people think about what do nurses do when they go off to war, that's not just battlefield injuries. And there was hepatitis, there was malaria, and there were burns. When helicopters are attacked and they fall to the ground, they crash and they burn. So we cared for a lot of our helicopter pilots and their crew and anyone in that chopper. I was in the burn unit for a while, and I also cared, and we nurses didn't expect this. We also cared for those who were injured, the villagers, the people, the Vietnamese, who were injured supposedly in the crossfires of war. We were responsible for caring for them. So now we've got mixed in our units, we've got children who have been burned by napalm and white phosphorus. And how do we treat those? We weren't taught in nursing school. We did gallbladders and we did appendectomy post-surgery. We did the traditional car accidents, drownings, those kinds of things. But now we're faced with things we learned fast. We learned very fast. Didn't take long to learn to measure up. We were there for them. They came first. We had to forget about how we were feeling, about what we were seeing, and about what we were doing. And we had to stop being afraid. We had to be brave because we had to measure up and we had to do our jobs. And we did. And I'll talk about that later as why I was so proud of the women and the men and the male nurses, the female nurses, and all the women, all the military or medics, everybody on the team, the respiratory therapists, the x-ray therapists, there were so many of us. And we had one job in Vietnam, and that was to get our soldiers back to their families or back to the field. And I can attest to the fact as how brave these young men were, because where did they want to go? They wanted to go back to the field. They wanted to go back to their unit. They wanted to go back to their buddies. And for those who got the $1 million wound, well, of course, that was the wound that sent you home. And it meant that you had a longer recovery time. It also meant that you might not survive. But we wanted to get these soldiers home on the air evac chain to get them to the next best place where they could get the care that would help them survive or get them home to their families. So that was the 36th evac. Well, after I was there for 6 months, I learned that we could request a different, we could request a change. And I said, well, I'm ready. I want to go north. So be careful what you ask for. I went to the chief nurse and I said, "Well, I'm ready. You can send me north to where the fighting. Send me where the fighting really is." Now, the 36th evac was not a safe place either, but it was an evacuation hospital, and a lot of the patients that were coming there were coming from other hospitals to have their delayed primary closures, their surgery. And some were coming right in out of the field. But the chief nurse said, "Well, I'm sending you to Pleiku. It's just a few kilometers from the Cambodian border. The fighting up there is really bad. The 4th Infantry Division is being overrun." And off I went. So a helicopter came to pick me up, and a few days later, I'm checking into Pleiku. It was interesting because for you veterans who are listening, if you ever were in the Central Highlands or in Pleiku, it was the jungle. And so, yeah, that's where Agent Orange was dropping because they defoliate the jungle. So the troops didn't have to bushwhack their way through the elephant grass, if you will. And when I landed on that chopper, everything was dead and brown and there was no foliage. And we'd just come from the jungle, and I didn't know about Agent Orange or Agent White, or I didn't know about any of that poisonous stuff that was being dumped. And but yeah, there was a lot of poison being dumped on us and the country. But I was there at the 71st evac, and now I'm a first lieutenant, so they make me a head nurse. It's a major slot, but they don't have any majors or any captains. But there's me. I've had 6 months experience. Now I'm head nurse in a postoperative surgical unit, and these are very seriously ill patients many of them are on ventilators, on respirators. They have tracheotomies, they have chest tubes, they have blood lines, there's IV lines. They require a lot of intensive care, and that unit is 45 beds. And the choppers started coming in with mass casualties. And for those of you who are listening, if you were in Vietnam, you were in helicopters. And the sound of that Huey, what a sound. But if it's in the middle, everything bad seemed to happen at night. And I think what I'll do for sake of time here is I'll paint a picture for you of one night in Vietnam. What was it? People say, what was it like in Vietnam? Okay, I'll tell you about one night. Okay. And I was in my hooch, sound asleep. Our shifts were 12 to 14 to 15 hours. We worked till the work was done. 6 days a week, not 2 or 3 days a week. It was 6 days a week, 7 if there was a push or mass casualties. We just kept working. So I heard a chopper coming in, but it was only one, not to get worried. One helicopter has how many patients? It's okay. But then I heard a different noise. It wasn't a Huey. What it was, then the hooch was shaking, and it was a Chinook. And I woke up and the phone was ringing. Open up the spare unit. And then I woke up all my hooch mates, but I didn't have to. They were already running to their units, to the ER and other places where their jobs were. So, but a Chinook came in loaded with patients. So now we have mass casualties. I was told to go open the spare unit, which was about a unit for 45 people. They brought in 27, the litter bearers brought in 27 patients. And it was just me and a medic, one medic. Everybody else was in their units doing their jobs. And the lights were out because it's dark, because we have blackouts at night. So he has a flashlight and I have a flashlight. And the litter bearers are bringing in and my ward master was setting up all these IVs. And so my medic and I looked at him and I looked at my patients and I said, these patients don't have any bullet holes. What's going on here? But they were near death. Well, they'd been out in the bush for who knows how long, but they were dehydrated and they'd been out in the bush for I don't know how long. They couldn't get them in because it was too dangerous. So here they are. They were in near death because their blood pressures were low. I could hardly find their pulse, and I'm supposed to start an IV in the dark. Well, I started with the first young boy, and I had the IV, and I said to my medic, I said, keep the flashlight. I know how to do this. And I wrote home. I remembered all this so clearly because I sent a letter home and I told my parents that that night I started 27 IVs on young soldiers who had collapsed veins. And that's how good I had gotten at starting IVs. And I got an IV in every one of those guys. And a doctor came in, and all he did was give me the orders for what to hang, Ringer's lactate, and get them hydrated, because that was the number one thing to save their life. We got to get their blood pressures up and their pulse going. And when we finished, the lieutenant or the medic said to me, "Lieutenant, do you notice what's going on here?" And I said, "Yeah, it's awful quiet." He said, "Yeah." He said, "We saved their lives." I said, "Yeah, well, the morning was now on the horizon. I had to get to my unit where I was head nurse, but we we got it done. We got that job done. We hydrated every one of those men, and they all survived." And the next night, like then after all of that and being up all night, I stayed and worked my 12-hour shift. And the next night, early in the morning, we were rocketed, and the hooch next to ours was blown off the face of the map. And the mirror in my room burst off. The mirror burst and crashed on the floor, and everything was shaking. It was like an earthquake, because it was an earthquake. It was a mortar right next to our hooch. And yeah, so we were not in safe areas. And I went to work, and our hospital was being rocketed, and there was shrapnel flying all over the place. And the first thing that our SOP was, get your helmet, get your flak jacket on, and get the patients under beds, because that's their bunker, right? Under a hospital bed. But a lot of the patients, we couldn't put them under the bed because they were the ones that with tracheotomies, chest tubes, they were on ventilators. So we took the spare mattresses and we put those on those who couldn't get under their beds. Now, for the patients who could get under, we didn't have to tell them, get under your bed. Those guys were under the bed and flash, they were on the ground. But they had pulled out their bloodlines and they'd pulled out their IVs. And I went around the unit and I got the blood. I made sure the IVs were stable, the bloodlines were okay. I looked around, made sure every single man, and they were all men, they were all soldiers. Back then, our soldiers were men, unlike today, where so many wounded are women. But the little girl who was in our unit, who had a circumferential napalm, she had been burned badly, and she was 3 or 4, but she was screaming because she was so terrified, because when their village was attacked with napalm, she lost her family. They brought her into our hospital. Now the hospital is being rocketed and she's terrified. So the last person I went to was to make sure I couldn't get her under her crib. That was impossible. She was in too much pain. So I just finally, after making sure everybody was taken care of, I got under the crib and I held her hand, and she screamed herself to death. She died that night. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because I want you to know that this is what women did in Vietnam. We were there to take care of the men. We were not shrinking violets. They came first. And, everything in Vietnam depended on how brave we were, how smart we were, how quick we were, and our skill sets that we had learned very quickly to help save these men's lives. And so that's just like a day and a half in the life of a nurse in Vietnam. So, okay, now it's 6 months there at Play Crew, and it's time for me to go home. And I wanted to stay. I wanted to do another year, but I knew I couldn't. I was losing weight I couldn't afford to lose, and I was really tired. And I thought, I need to go home and recover and then maybe come back. So, August 1st, I arrived back in Minnesota, or August 2nd, whatever it was. And my DROS was I arrived at Travis Air Force Base and I had my exit physical, and they said I had a spot on my lung and that I should go get it checked out. So I went and got it checked out. And then I went to wherever, the terminal was, and to get a flight home. And I went up to the sergeant and I said, well, I need my ticket to go home. I was wearing my uniform. And he said, well, ma'am, you've had your exit physical, you're done, you're discharged. And I said, well, yes, but can I get my ticket home now? And he said, you don't get a ticket home. You pay for it yourself. You're out of the Army now, ma'am. And I said, I'm in my uniform. I just got back from Vietnam and you're telling me I have to pay for my own ticket to go back to Minnesota? Yes, ma'am, you're out of the Army now. I was incredulous. The Army didn't pay for me to go home. I was warned not to wear my uniform home because it's 1969 and the war protests are vicious. They're hostile and they're taking out their hostility against us veterans. I'd heard about it. We didn't, we heard about things going on back home and it wasn't pretty. It wasn't good. So I was warned, don't wear your uniform home because it can set you up. And I'm wearing my uniform home. I'm proud of this uniform. I don't care what people do to me. I'm going home in this uniform. So I arrived at the Minneapolis airport and my duffel bag is coming down the conveyor belt. And these two young enlisted men had also come back from Vietnam and we were chatting, and one of them said to me, I'll get that for you, Lieutenant. And he grabs my duffel bag and helps me with it. It's heavy. And there's some war protesters hanging out. And one of them says to this enlisted man, let her carry her own damn bags. She's in a man's army. Oh, that was the wrong thing to say to the enlisted guy. He went over and grabbed him and punched him in the face, and he got a bloody nose and he was laying on the floor. And his the the young enlisted man who was helping me, his buddy said, let's get the hell out of here. This is nothing but trouble. And they ran off. Welcome home. This was our welcome home. And they were all bystanders. All the passengers who witnessed this just stood there and said nothing. And the war protesters, they ran off too, but I was so glad to see one of them got a bloody nose. I mean, he deserved it. It was so awful. I'm so glad my parents didn't see it. They were late. My dad was always late. He was a dairy farmer. The cows and the crops always came first. I'm so glad they didn't have to witness that. Okay, welcome home. So now what was it like for me as a woman? Well, as a woman, I could hide. Did I look like a Vietnam vet? I was 22. No, I did not look like a Vietnam veteran. And I didn't wear my boonie hat. I didn't wear my field jacket. I didn't wear any of that. I left it in the Foot Locker, and I didn't want to be recognized as a Vietnam vet. I wanted to hide, and I hid really well. I just didn't want to talk to anybody about it because it would just set me up to be humiliated. So I just kept it to myself, or thought I did, for a lot of years. And my husband he was really supportive. And I told him, don't tell anybody I was in Vietnam. I don't want them to know. It's something I'll just be treated with hostility. So he was pretty quiet about it. But as you know, I'm going to get a little drink of water here. As you know, in 1982, there was a dedication of the wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And when I heard about it and I learned that there would be names on the wall, I knew I had to go. So I told my husband, I went to Vietnam alone. I came home alone. I have to do this alone. I let him know I didn't want him with me. I regretted that later, and I think he was pretty hurt. But basically, I didn't want him to see me cry or see me. I hadn't cried. I had no tears. I never cried over Vietnam. I never had a funeral. I never had a wake for those young men I cared for. And I just didn't, I just pretty much isolated and kept everything to myself. And my worst fear was that I would break down and cry in front of other people. Remember, I was stoic like my Swedish dad, I guess. I learned that lesson well from how I grew up. Um, so I march in the parade, and there's people along the parade saying thank you, and there's signs, welcome home Vietnam vets, and it was unbelievable. But then I got to the wall and I stood there and I had to find Eddie Lee Evanson's name because he was one of mine, my first ones who I remembered so well, who was one of my patients. I found where his name was, and I wanted to find Sharon Lane. Sharon Lane was killed in June of 1969 in Chu Lai by enemy fire, a piece of shrapnel. She was caring for a patient. She was on duty in her hospital, and a piece of shrapnel hit her in the neck, and she died instantly. And I found out about it when I was, working. A medic tapped me on the shoulder and said, Lieutenant, an Army nurse was just killed at Chu Lai. It went around like wildfire. And I didn't know of the Army nurses that had already died in Vietnam. Nobody told me about this. 4 nurses went down in a helicopter, TDY, from Pleiku, 2 male nurses and 2 female nurses. Did I even know that? No, nobody told me that. I thought she was the first. So I stood before the 68 and 69 plaque. And if you've been to that memorial, the 1968 and 1969 marble plaques, if you will, or the wall is the tallest and the widest because that's when like 35,000 men and women died during those 2 years. It was the height of the war. And when I found Eddie's name, um, I broke down and cried, and I couldn't stop. It was the first time I had cried. And when I got home from that experience, went into my bedroom and slammed the door. And my little daughter, who was about 10, Carrie, was banging on my door. Knock, knock, knock. Mom, let me in, let me in. No, I'm fine. Mom, let me in. So she walked in and she said, Mom, you're crying. I know I'm not. I'm not. Yes, Mom, you're crying. I was trying to deny the whole thing. She said, Mom, those are healing tears. You need to cry. It's okay. So I cried a lot. And then I was depressed and I was having nightmares. And long story short, I found a vet center, found out I was the first woman the vet center had had. They were all men, but they were wonderful. They were kind. They were welcoming. But then I learned after the wall that they were going to dedicate a new statue or an addition to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and it was going to be a statue of 3 men. And I saw it in the paper. I saw a picture, and I thought, well, that's fine if it's a nice statue, if that's what the men want. But they forgot somebody. What about the women? So I went to the dedication of that, and I came home and I said to my husband, honey, if they're going to have a statue to men, there has to be one to women, or they'll never know women were there and they'll never know what we did. And we were there to bring those men home alive. And if the men belong there, the women belong there. If the women belonged in Vietnam, they belong at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. There needs to be a statue there. And my husband said, well, who's going to do that? And I said, honey, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to do something. So this would take another few days to tell you that whole story, but it's also in the book. I started making phone calls, a lot of phone calls. And we had a lot of phone call. We had a big bill for phone calls, believe me. And I found allies and I found other people, and I had a meeting and more meetings and more meetings and more meetings, and started the nonprofit, the Vietnam Women's Memorial, to build with the mission of building a statue honoring the women, not just the nurses, but all the women who had served around the world during the Vietnam era. They were all important, just like all our men were important. Wherever they served, we needed them serving all over the world. I mean, we're a team. That's how we get things done. And so I wanted the monument to honor all the women, whatever their rank, whatever their wherever they served, but that the monument, whatever it would look like, it had to look like women, right? And so, long story short, um, after the strategy of getting support, like from the American Legion, the VFW, the DAV, the Vietnam Veterans of America, Military Order, all of them, I went to all of their conventions and spoke before them to ask for their support. And one by one, it wasn't easy, believe me. There was a lot of pushback, and there were a lot of mean-spirited, shall we say, a lot of mean-spirited men who were really hostile towards us, but there were just a few of them, right? So we worked around them and found the really good guys, and there were really a lot of good men out there, and a lot of them had been our patients. And those wounded soldiers stepped up to support us. And then we got high-ranking people like General Colin Powell and Admiral Crowe, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And man, I started making phone calls to even to the Pentagon, and people were taking my calls. And we started raising money. And, by the end of the day, we raised $5 million, and to make it to make it all happen. And so finally, after, lobbying Congress and getting a congressional bill passed, and I testified at over 35 hearings before the federal agencies. There was the National Capital Planning Commission, there was the National Capital Memorial Commission, there was the Commission of Fine Arts, Department of Interior. Oh my goodness. And doing anything in DC is almost impossible anyway. I don't know how I did it, but you know what? It was resilience. I was tired. I'm human. I wanted to quit. I'm human. I would come home from hearings and tell Mike I quit. We have 4 kids under the age of 10 when I started this. My wonderful mother retired from nursing, and she said, Diane, I'll come and take care of the kids whenever you have to be gone. And she did. So when I left to do all of this, my mom was with the kids, and my husband loved my mother, and so did the grandkids. So the kids were safe, they were fed, everything, they were fine when I was gone. So I had a lot of help, but I didn't give up. And the resilience part came from, you know, I would tell myself, how many times did I tell myself, if I could do what I did in Vietnam, I can do this. And on the farm, we never quit. You couldn't quit, because if you quit, you wouldn't eat, and the animals would die, right? The crops would die. You couldn't quit. You had to you had to get up in the morning and get back at work. And I thought, the other thing I said to myself was, well, if I fail at this, if I fail in my effort to honor the women who served, nobody will die. In Vietnam, if I failed, I'm serious when I tell you, if someone died on our watch in Vietnam, we blamed ourselves. What did we do wrong? What could we have done better? What should we have done to save this man's life? We took it very personally when we lost a patient in our unit. And we grieved over that until the next patient. And there wasn't time to really grieve. We just moved on to the next, to the next, and the next. So, so yeah, I told myself, well, just keep going, because if I fail, at least nobody's going to die. I just have to face the facts that I failed. And, but, we didn't fail. And it's because we didn't give up. I guess persistence overcomes resistance. And that's kind of the story. Like when I talk to a lot of young people, like, how do you accomplish a mission that you believe in? Well, you find allies. You do not do this alone. I give credit in my book to everybody who helped. I didn't do this alone. Oh my God. There were hundreds of people who stepped up to support and send money and write letters, and they supported me and they supported the effort. But it's all about not giving up. We never gave up on a patient in Vietnam, ever. We never gave up on a patient. So I couldn't give up on this either. So on Veterans Day 1993, there was a parade for us. We marched down Constitution Avenue. Over 25,000 people were there. And of course, most of them were the male veterans because there's more of them, right? 10,000 of us women were in Vietnam and 2.9 million of them served during the Vietnam. I mean, the men were there to thank us and to support us. And it meant so much to us women to finally hear those two words, thank you. I want to give you some examples of, well, why did we succeed? It wasn't just about the testifying and trying to convince, the agencies and the press, because the press was really awful towards us at first. When we first started out, the editors of national newspapers would write articles about, well, how can you argue with Army nurses, but it's a bad idea. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is closed, it's finished. And adding a statue of a woman now at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is like adding Elvis Presley to Mount Rushmore. And I'm like, what? What did he just say? But that didn't finish it. Then he said, well, maybe we should paint a woman in the canoe with George Washington crossing the Delaware, or paint the Statue of Liberty Day glow pink. Would that satisfy the women? It was so cruel. It was so illogical. It's like, what did he just say? Another article said adding a statue of a woman at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is like adding a tacky lawn ornament. Well, the one nasty thing that was said that helped us was the Commissioner of Fine Arts when I appeared before them with our proposal. Now, this was the first time to go to Washington, D.C. and present before the Commission of Fine Arts, which is the gatekeeper to anything that goes up in Washington, D.C. artistically. And you have to testify before them what your proposal is. So several of us testified that we believe that adding a statue of a woman at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial will complete the healing that takes place there. That we have the wall, we have the statue of three men. The statue of three women will complete this memorial because it honors all those who served, men and women. And there were 6 people on the commission, and they voted and rejected, they flat out rejected it. But the one thing that the Commissioner of Fine Arts said that came back to bite him in the butt was, he said, well, we have had so many proposals to add things to the Vietnam Memorial because the wall was so successful. We've had a proposal from the Scout Dog Association to have a bronze dog placed at the memorial. So if we let the women have a statue, we'll have to let the Scout dogs have their statue. Well, no, nothing against Scout dogs, and yes, but he had just put us in the same sentence. Well, we were very dejected. We were horrified by they never said thank you to us for our service. They were just hostile. They were downright hostile to us. And so now I'm home back in the office that I've set up in Minneapolis, a little postage stamp office that the building gave us free of charge, no windows in it, but one telephone. And the phone rang, and it was someone from 60 Minutes. And this woman representing Morley Safer, who, as you know, Morley Safer was a journalist in Vietnam for 5 years, off and on, and now was on 60 Minutes interviewing people. So she said, may I speak to Diane Evans? And I said, well, speaking. And she said, Mr. Safer wants to know if you would come on 60 Minutes and tell us why Mr. J. Carter Brown said that if they give the women a statue, they have to give the dogs a statue. And she said, did he really say that? And I said, yes, he did. Well, ABC, NBC, all the networks at the time were at that hearing. And then it was in the newspapers that it was flat out rejected. But they also quoted Mr. Brown as comparing us to the Canine Corps. So she said, Mr. Safer wants you to come on and talk about why you think that memorial is important, and find 4 other nurses to also be on 60 Minutes. And well, when you're asked to go on 60 Minutes, you start to shake, then you start to sweat, and you just hope they're on your side. But I said, yes, I will do that. I called almost 20 Vietnam veteran nurses, and they all said no. They said, I don't even talk to my husband about Vietnam. You think I'm going on 60 Minutes? I can't even talk about this, let alone talk to the world about this. They were terrified. I was terrified too. But I finally found 4 other women, and I had to convince one of them. She was still wearing the uniform. She was still in the Army Nurse Corps, Maggie Areola, and she was in Alaska, and she was from Minnesota, so I knew her. And I said, Maggie, would you be willing to go on 60 Minutes and talk about your experiences in Vietnam and how you feel about the Commission of Fine Arts disparaging us and treating us so cruelly? And she said, Diane, I'm still wearing the uniform. I can't talk outside of the military. And she said, well, don't wear your uniform on 60 Minutes and don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Well, 75 million viewers are watching it, or however many people. So she called me back and she said, Diane, I'll do it. I'm glad she did, because I'm going to share one part of this 60 Minutes piece that Morley Safer did that was the turning point for us. And then I'll explain why, and then my 20 minutes will be up. So Maggie had film footage of herself in Vietnam, which was pretty rare because we didn't take many pictures of our patients or each other on duty. And so she's on 60 Minutes, and there's film footage of her working in the emergency room, caring for patients in the ER and hanging an IV. And he asked her some questions, and then he said, Maggie, did you ever cry in Vietnam? And she said, only once. And then he wanted to know. He said, yes. And she said, well, this soldier came in and he had had battlefield amputations. Both of his arms and both of his legs were missing. He had an eye hanging out of his socket, and he had blast injuries to his torso. And he was still talking to us. Now that is thanks to those medics there and to those helicopter pilots, like that golden hour. If they can get those patients to us, we saved 98% of them if they came in within the first 2 hours. He was not in shock because that medic had done a cut down. He had gotten albumin going. The chopper had gotten him to us like so fast that he was still talking. And he looked at Maggie and he said, is there a rabbi? He was Jewish. And she said to her, the medic, go get so-and-so, a surgeon who was Jewish, but there was no rabbi. So the medic went off to find that surgeon. And she said, he said to her, I know I don't have any arms and I know I don't have any legs, but please tell my mother I love her. And she cried. And Mr. Safer said, did he live? And she said, I don't know. And she said, I have felt guilty all these years because I never talked to his mother. I couldn't. She said, what would I have told her about how he looked? And we sent him off to the operating room, and I don't think he made it. But, we were too busy to follow up, and we didn't really want to know if they didn't make it. Then we would have been happy if knowing they did. But she said, I couldn't stop crying. Well, so the other nurses were interviewed, and they all had amazing experiences to share. Well, now there's millions of people for the first time in history listening and seeing and learning about what nurses did in Vietnam, and they had no clue, right? Except if they were the mother of a wounded soldier, and that wounded soldier told their family about us. Those guys knew about us, but nobody was asking. So long story short, quickly, there was a phone call to 60 Minutes. And this phone call was from a soldier whose name was Lloyd Cantor, and he lived in the Bronx in New York. And he said to the person answering the phone at 60 Minutes, he said, I am listening. He couldn't see, he was blind. I'm listening to 60 Minutes, and there's this nurse talking about a Jewish boy who wanted his mother and didn't have any arms and he didn't have any legs. That was me. I'm alive. I want her to know she saved my life. I want to meet her. Well, this was incredulous. This was that the fact that he was even watching 60 Minutes, and his wife was in the kitchen. He was married before he left, and they were still together. And she had come running in, and because he said, "Come in, she's talking about me." So 60 Minutes, um, you know, interviewed him and found out this was real. And they called Maggie and said, "Maggie, your patient lived and he wants to meet you." So they, on the next 60 Minutes show, or the last one of the Wednesday or whenever it was, 60 Minutes brought those two together. And there was Lloyd thanking his nurse. We'll talk about tears and talk about the impact on the people around America seeing this. It was phenomenal. Well, so I go back into my office with no windows and one phone, and I have one staff person now, and I have volunteers, and my phone won't stop ringing. It's constant. People are Hundreds of people are calling and saying, "I want to support. Where do I send money? I want to support. My son was killed in Vietnam. Can you help me find the nurse who cared for him?" And then we got all these calls from wounded soldiers who said, "I want to find my nurse who took care of me." It's like I couldn't keep up. So we moved out of that office into a bigger office, and the money started rolling in. We raised $1 million right in months after that. And then before my 20 minutes is up, I want to tell you some of the letters that came in. They were so precious. There was a letter with two $1 bills in it and was from a small child, judging by the writing. And she said, "This is my allowance. It's all I have, but I want you to have it because you saved my daddy's life." It was like tear jerking. And there was no computer, wasn't email and text. We were getting telegrams. We could not keep up. So we got more volunteers. We hired more staff because now we had money, and that money started paying for my phone bills and my trips to DC. And then this letter came from a wounded soldier, and it was his entire disability check. And he'd signed it over to the Vietnam Women's Memorial with a note that said, "I am going to send you my disability check every month until your memorial is built. Please don't tell my wife." These, these were the kinds of letters that we got. And oh my gosh, the poetry. I didn't know wounded soldiers were poets, but they became poets. And they wrote us poetry to the nurses to thank us for saving their lives. And it was so heartfelt. It was so beautiful. I saved every one of them. We have those letters, and they're all the archives, every shred. I'm a saver. Thankfully, that's how I was able to write my book. I had journal entries, I had calendar entries, I'd saved all my testimony. I had saved everything because I knew that someday I was going to have to prove that this is really what we went through, us women, to have to spend 10 years to prove that we were honorable and deserved recognition for our contribution and saving, over something like 350,000 men were wounded in Vietnam. They didn't all go to hospitals. Some went to aid stations and went back to duty, but many of them were hospitalized. And we cared for these men and helped save lives. And we were with many of the men whose names are on the wall. This was the message that I was trying to hit these guys over the head with a 2x4. Hey, wake up. This is who we are. This is what we did. Oh, and one more thing. So having to testify in front of these three federal agencies, they had to, once we had a design competition because the Commission of Fine Arts didn't like our first proposal. They rejected the design by Roger Bodine from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who I went to, and asked if he would work with me to design a statue. That's the design that we took to the Commission of Fine Arts, and they didn't like it. In fact, J. Carter Brown said, "The poor nurse looks like she wants to upchuck in her helmet." Well, yeah, that's kind of how we felt a lot of times. They just said such derogatory things. So we knew when we weren't going to quit, right? So we went to Congress to get a bill passed that would mandate. So J. Carter Brown couldn't make the decision. Congress made the decision. We got a bill passed. But then we had to find a design. So we had a design competition. And then we found Glenna Goodacre from Santa Fe, New Mexico, who designed what you see today in Washington, D.C. And finally, through all those reviews, now they see that design and now they have to vote on it. All three of those agencies have to be, it has to be unanimous. It can't be 2 out of 3. And I'm like, I'm testifying now in front of every one of them, and I have to convince them that this statue is perfect. It's who we are. It's 3 women and a wounded soldier. We love that wounded soldier. That's why we went to Vietnam, was to bring those guys home. And Glenna put that wounded soldier in as the statement that that's what we were there for. And women serving all around the world, we wanted to reflect them too. So there's 3 women, and they're not all nurses. It's for all women. The one nurse caring for the wounded soldier reflects her role, but we wanted no rank on that. There's no rank, there's no insignia. So those are enlisted women, those are officer women. There's no insignia that says where we served, like medical brigade or, Big Red One or wherever. There was no insignia. So it's a statue that portrays women. It's honors women. And so now at the grand finale, like I am testifying for the last time, it's now or never. We either lose or we win. And it all hinges on what I have to tell these people to convince them. So of course I was up all night writing my testimony, and I had about 17 pages, which is ridiculous. But when I got there and I stood at that podium to speak to them, I left that speech on my chair. And I thought, I'm just going to get up and I'm just going to tell them what this is about. And so I said to them what was in the Commemorative Works Act, which we had to follow. That was a bill that said to put anything on the National Mall, this is the criteria, this is the policy. Well, I memorized that practically, so I knew what was in it. So I used the language that was in that. And so my final statement to them was, is not the saving of 300,000 lives in Vietnam and more than 58,000 names on the wall, is that not of lasting preeminent historical significance to our nation? That's all I said. No 17 pages. That's all I said. Because that's what was in the Commemorative Works Act, that our memorial had to do that. And I sat down and they voted yes in all 3 of those agency hearings, and we won. And talk about resilience.
We have a few questions, but first, let's give Miss Diane Carlson Evans.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions for you before we end tonight. Are you available? Can you hear me through this microphone?
Yep, I'm hearing you.
Okay. So, with one of our audience members would like to know, with all of the horror and trauma that you've endured during the war, were there any moments of extreme joy and happiness other than the feeling of going home?
Yes, going home. Sort of joy and happiness. That was, I didn't want to go home. I really kind of wanted to stay. It was strange. For the veterans who are listening, you know, we understand, we speak that same language. It was hard going home, but yeah, being on the plane was like, hey, we're going home, but what's it going to be like when we get there, kind of thing. But yeah, so in my book, you'll read about cinnamon rolls. So I grew up making cinnamon rolls on the farm. We did all our own, as my sister and I, we had to do all the baking and all the cooking, and I could make cinnamon rolls in my sleep. So one night it was actually quiet in my unit. The patients were all kind of sleeping. There was one other nurse in the unit, and my medics were. I said, I'm going to sneak down to the mess hall pantry, or whatever they called it. They didn't call it a pantry, but I went down there, and there was a mama-san sleeping on one of the benches where the flour and stuff was stored, and I scared her, and she woke up and she screamed and she ran away, and then I grabbed the flour and the yeast, and I grabbed everything I was going to need, and I brought it back. And then when I got off duty, I took it to my hooch, and there was actually a hooch that had a nurse's lounge in it and had an oven. and a sink, and we could boil water and make tea or do whatever we wanted down in that. So I made cinnamon rolls and I baked them, and I got up really early to do that. And then I brought him into the ward the next day, the unit, and I told the medics, I said, when it's coffee break time, there's cinnamon rolls out in the break room. Oh my God, did that ever make everybody happy? Just the smell. And people were like, oh, this is heavenly. This is like, because the smells in Vietnam were not good. And the only good smells I remember in Vietnam were the coffee and the perfume some of us wore, because some of us did wear a light fragrance because the soldiers really liked it. We smelled like home. We smelled clean, right? There were no good smells in Vietnam. So I found out that, well, cinnamon rolls are really popular. So I made them frequently. Well, I have to tell you, I loved my medics and they were awesome. And I wanted to thank them and give them credit for what they'd done. I praised them. I patted them on the back whenever I could. And boy, the cinnamon rolls, that did it. So then I get the one of the nursing supervisors comes onto my unit and she's all crabby and she's all cranky and she says, Lieutenant, the chief nurse wants to see you in her office. And my medics all heard this and I was like, oh, did my family member die? Or I didn't think I'd killed anyone, but why do I have to be called into her office? So I go in there and I salute and I say, yes, ma'am. And she said, Lieutenant, I don't like that you're fraternizing with the enlisted and you're getting too cozy and too tight with your medics. I want you to quit making those cinnamon rolls and fraternizing with the medics. I was dumbfounded. I was like, what's this? This is I've been called into her because I'm making friggin' cinnamon rolls. I almost laughed in her face. I was like smirking. I know I was. And I couldn't how to contain my face to keep a straight face. And when I turned around and walked out, I was like, what just happened? Did she ever thank me for doing a good job in she never came around to thank us nurses for doing a good job or Lieutenant, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do to help? Do you have enough supplies? No, she never did that. So anyway, I went back into my unit and the medics were like, and I was smirking and I was laughing and the medics looked at me and said, well, what happened? And I burst out laughing and I said, she said she doesn't like me fraternizing with you and being nice to you. Actually, she said I have to quit making cinnamon rolls. And they were all incredulous. They were like, oh. So guess what I did? I kept making cinnamon rolls. I worked with a wonderful co-author, just so you know, Bob Welch worked with me on the book because I'd never written a book. Like, where do I start my chapters? How do I do this? And so he interviewed me and I had all my testimonies and and I had already written the book. Basically, I just didn't know how to put it together. So I was telling him about the cinnamon rolls and I said, but that's not important. Don't put that in the book. He said, are you kidding? That's really important. I'm putting that in the book. So what does everybody say to me after they've read the book? Diane, can I have your cinnamon roll recipe?
We have a special speaker here that wants to speak with you.
Hi, Diane. It's Sarah Taylor, past national president of American Gold Star Mothers.
Oh.
Had the distinct pleasure of meeting her in 2018 at the 30th anniversary of the dedication of the Women's Monument. And to hear these women's stories, they are all so humble because what they did is more than any of us can ever know. And Diane, I'd like to think that when my son was hurt before he passed in Afghanistan, that he had the love of someone like you, maybe even Marsha Ford, I don't know. Y'all are all so humble because what you did is whether these soldiers passed or not, you were the last bit of hope and the last bit of love for some of them. And we can never thank you enough for what you've done, what all of you have done. And I just want to say, welcome home.
Thank you. It's that thank you. And I knew that the Vietnam Women's Memorial would be so healing for the Gold Star families and all the families who came there, because they would see that woman tending to that soldier who was their soldier, because he's an anonymous soldier. And he represents all of them. And the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans come to our memorial and say, this is ours too, because they relate to it. It's women and it's men, and that we were there for each other, and that our job was to get each other home alive. And I can assure you, if he was in a hospital or wherever he was, there were medics, doctors, nurses, or his buddies that were there for him. And that was one of the messages that was so important to us nurses, was for parents and loved ones to know we cared. And they, in Vietnam, they never died alone. If they were in a hospital, we stayed with them. They may have been put behind that curtain because they were not expected to live, that they would just have moments and could not get to the operating room. But there was someone standing there, sitting there with them, holding their hand, talking to them. And that was me too. I did that. So I know that it happened. So thank you.
We also have a gentleman here that served in Vietnam. I know there's plenty that served here. Is there any other who served in Vietnam? Present with us. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. So we have some soldiers here with us tonight. Also, we talked a lot about in the beginning of this, all started with a community read that we started with The Women by Kristen Hanna. I know you have a little bit of insight into that. Would you mind giving us a little bit about your relationship with Kristen and how this all came about?
That's quite the story. I've
Well,
got
maybe a little one.
how many minutes do we have?
Whatever you tell me we have. This is
Okay.
how many we have.
So out of the blue, I get an email from Kristen Hanna. Well, I know who she is because I've read her books. My favorite was The Nightingale. So she says to me that she's writing a story about Vietnam nurses, and she had read my book, and she'd read a lot of other books written by Vietnam nurses. That's where she got her stories. And so, excuse me. So, but she said, would you be willing to read my manuscript and check for, any mistakes, make corrections, additions, and for my book? And I said, well, so I called her. She gave me her phone number, and I said, well, Kristen, I know who you are. So if somebody's going to write a book about us, you're a really good writer. And I said, I'd be willing to read your manuscript, but there is a caveat you need to know first. If I don't like it, I will tell you. She laughed and she said, good, that's just what I want. And I said, I've dedicated my whole life, Kristen, to honoring these women in an honorable way, and to tell the truth about them. And I know yours is going to be fiction, and you can say whatever you want, but it's got to be full of truth and about who we are and what we did. And so she sent me the manuscript. It was huge because the book is big and it was double spaced. And I thought, oh, this will take me a year to get through this, but it didn't, because I couldn't stop reading it. So it came, and at 6 o'clock after we'd had supper, I started reading, and I couldn't stop till midnight. Well, that night, my husband, as a witness, we sleep in the same bed. I had the worst nightmare I've ever had, and I've had a lot of nightmares. I was shaking. I was saying I don't know what, and Mike woke me up and said, he reminded me of where I am, and he said, you have to stop reading that book, because he knew that that's what triggered it. Well, I got up in the morning and I was exhausted, and I said, well, I just won't read it at night, but I'm going to read it. So I read it for several hours every morning, and I did give it a clean sweep many, many times. And I said, Kristen, you weren't there. You got this all wrong. That was not what it was like in the operating room. Would you be willing to talk to an OR nurse who was at Cu Chi and during TET? And she will set you straight about the OR. I wasn't an OR nurse. And she said, I'd love to, please, will she talk to me? So Kristen got that straight. Well, then the helicopter, that was all wrong. The geography, and it was like, oh my God, any helicopter crew member who reads your book is going to throw it across the room. Kristen, you've got it all wrong. Would you talk to a helicopter pilot who did like 2,000 missions, survived 2 years in Vietnam as a dust-off helicopter pilot? Yes, I'd love to talk to him. So to Kristen's credit, what she did, she talked to people who were actually there to make it historically accurate, because that's what historical fiction does. And then I talked to her about the nurses that it was about nurses, not all the women, but the nurses. And I said, well, you've got all three nurses doing the same thing. That's 100%. You're painting us all with the same brush, but a lot of us did not do drugs or alcohol or party or sleep with doctors, whatever. I said, one of those nurses has to be like a lot of us that didn't, like myself, I really was not judgmental in Vietnam. Whatever anybody else did, that was their business. And what I did was my business. And I had never dabbled in drugs or alcohol, and I was too afraid of it. I was young, I was 21, and I needed my sleep at night. So, yeah, she said, you're absolutely right. So most everything, not everything, that I kind of advised her on, she said she had no ego, and she was wonderful to work with. So the book is her book, it's her story, and a lot of the cleanup that needed to be done is in there. And but never did in my wildest dreams did I realize that it would become a bestseller. I mean, immediately it was on the New York Times, and for weeks and weeks it was #1. And so what Kristen has done for us is she has elevated the knowledge of who women were in Vietnam. She calls the book The Women. And the audience for this book is a younger audience, and they knew nothing of this, and they love it. They love this book, and they talk about it in book clubs, and it's overseas now, and it's in a lot of languages. I have a friend in Poland. She said she wrote to me and she said, I was in the bookstore and there's The Women by Kristen Hanna, and it's written in Polish. And it's very popular overseas. And it's just what it's done is spotlighted and highlighted us women who served. So the information, it is out there now. And she tells people in her book to read my book. So now my book is selling really well. She said, well, now I'm going to read Healing Wounds. So Healing Wounds immediately went on #1 bestseller list, but in the Vietnam biography category, not New York Times. I'll never be there. But the Vietnam War biography it hovers between 1 and 10. Sometimes it goes up to #15, but so the information about our service has been really spotlighted by Kristen Hanna, and we can thank her for that.
Yes, and actually, most of the people here today will be leaving with your book. They all came and got their ticket, and we're gonna send them home with it. But when we're finished today, but before we conclude, do you have any parting words that you would like to share to end the night on?
Well, I just thank you for being a wonderful audience. And I said yes to Emily because it's by Zoom. I'm being very open about the fact because everybody asks, so many people know of me. And so I was diagnosed 2 years ago with cancer that's been determined to be Agent Orange related. But I'm on wonderful modern medicine and immunotherapy now. I'm doing okay. And so any opportunity I have, like Emily and Shannon's invitation to be with you tonight, I take if I can do it by Zoom, because I love sharing stories about my sister vets. That's what I love best doing, because they deserve the honor and the respect and everything that they're now getting with more notoriety of who we are and what we've done. And I encourage veterans to write their stories and share their stories too. So thank you.
Thank you.